Serena Valmont walked into the private ICU like she owned every molecule of air inside it. She didn't knock. She didn't slow down. She moved through the glass doors with the particular confidence of someone who had never once been told no and had no intention of starting today. Her heels hit the polished floor in a precise rhythm, unhurried, deliberate, and every nurse at the station looked up, then immediately looked away. She stopped in front of Mara Ellison. Mara was 27, 2 weeks into a temporary assignment, still carrying the particular stillness of someone who had learned early that the wrong movement at the wrong moment cost everything. She was checking the IV line on room 4's monitor when Serena positioned herself 6 inches too close and let the silence do its work. "You're the new one," Serena said. It wasn't a question. "The one they sent me." Mara turned. "I was assigned to this floor, yes. Is there something you need?" Serena looked at her the way at something you've already decided to throw away. She tilted her head, slow, theatrical, and let her eyes travel from Mara's hospital issue, clogs up to her face, pausing at each stop long enough to make the assessment obvious. "Tell me something." Serena's voice was pleasant. That was the worst part. "Where did they find you?" "Community college." "Some weekend certification program." She glanced at the other nurses who had stopped pretending to work. "I specifically requested someone qualified. Someone who could handle the pressure of this environment." She gestured vaguely at the room around her, the monitors, the sealed door to room 4, the man unconscious inside it. "This isn't a teaching hospital. This isn't a learning experience. My fiancé is in that room, and his life depends on the competence of the people caring for him." Mara's hands were completely still. "I graduated top of my program," she said. "I've been briefed on Mr. Varelli's case, and I'm qualified to be here." Serena smiled. "It didn't reach anything." "Of course you are." She leaned forward, dropping her voice just enough that it felt intimate and humiliating at once. "But, sweetheart, being technically qualified and being able to handle what happens in that room when the wrong people come through that door are 2 completely different things. You look like you'd faint if someone raised their voice." She stepped back and looked at the senior nurse at the station. "Is there anyone else available? Someone with more experience? Someone who won't fall apart the first time one of Dante's associates decides they don't like the way she looked at them?" The room went quiet in the particular way that meant everyone was listening, and no one was going to say a word. Mara didn't look at the other nurses. She kept her eyes on Serena. "I won't fall apart," she said. Serena studied her for a moment, genuinely curious. The way you're curious about a small creature that surprises you by not running. Then she turned away. "Done." "We'll see," she said, and walked toward room 4 to visit the man she was going to marry. "Stayed with me this far, you already know this story isn't going to end the way Serena planned. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what comes next, because the next few parts are going to shake you. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what happened in that ICU, you need to understand who Mara Ellison actually was. The hospital that assigned Mara to the Varelli private ward did not tell her whose family it was. That was deliberate. The administrators who handled that arrangement were careful, practiced, and well compensated for their discretion, and the name Varelli meant something specific in this city. It meant you didn't repeat it louder than necessary, and you didn't ask questions that required the other person to lie. Mara found out on her second day. She was in the break room, eating a sandwich she didn't taste, when one of the floor nurses, a woman named Celia, who had worked that ward for 11 years and had survived by knowing exactly how much to say, and when sat down across from her and looked at her the way you look at someone standing in the road who hasn't heard the car yet. "Do you know who's in room 4? Celia asked. "Shooting victim," Mara said. 38, male. Blunt cranial trauma from the fall after the initial wound. Induced coma for swelling management. 10 days. Stable vitals. That's what the chart says. Celia kept her voice flat. "What I'm asking is if you know who he is." Mara looked at her. "Dante Varelli," Celia said. "The Varelli family. You understand what that means?" Mara understood. You couldn't live in this city for 3 years without understanding. She set her sandwich down and said nothing. "The woman who came in this morning," Celia continued. "Serena Valmont. She's his fiancée. Her father runs the Port Authority contracts, which means he and Dante have been business partners for 6 years, which means she has been in and out of this ward every day since he was brought in, and she treats this floor like it belongs to her, because in every way that matters, she believes it does. Celia paused. She requested you specifically. Mara looked up. She went through the temp agency list, Celia said. She picked you. I don't know why. I don't know what she told them, but she chose you out of a list of 12 available nurses and had you assigned to his room. Mara sat with that for a moment. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Celia stood up and collected her coffee. Because in 11 years on this floor, I've seen 4 temporary nurses assigned to that room. 2 of them quit within a week. One had a breakdown in the parking lot after a man in a suit explained to her that accidents were easier to arrange than she might think. She stopped at the door. I just want you to know what you're walking into. She left. Mara finished her sandwich. She sat in the break room for 4 more minutes before going back to work. She had walked into worse things than this. Room 4 was quiet, the way expensive rooms were quiet, a constructed silence, a managed peace that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with control. The monitors tracked Dante Varelli's breathing, his pulse, the slow, steady information of a body working to repair itself. He looked, in the way that unconscious men sometimes did, younger than his reputation. Mara had read the chart 3 times by the time Serena arrived for her morning visit on day 3. She had also read, in the particular way she had learned to read things, the patterns of who came and went. 2 men in dark coats stationed at the end of the corridor who never spoke to the medical staff but watched everything. A man who came each evening and stood inside room 4 for exactly 9 minutes, never touching anything, then left. The occasional visitor who smiled too wide and asked too casually how the patient was progressing. She catalogued all of it the way you catalogued things when you had grown up understanding that safety was not a given condition. It was information, assembled carefully, held lightly, used when necessary. On day 4, Serena arrived with 2 women who were clearly there to perform an audience. Stopped inside the door of room 4 while Mara was adjusting the IV rate, and she said, loud enough to be heard in the corridor, I keep expecting her to be gone. They send us the strangest people. One of the women laughed. The sound was practiced and hollow. Mara made a notation in the chart. You can leave now, Serena said. I need time with him. I'll need 5 more minutes to finish the adjustment, Mara said. Then I'll be out of your way. I said now. Mara looked at her. Then she looked at the IV, completed the adjustment, made the final notation, and walked out. Stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. The man in the dark coat at the end of the hall was watching her. She met his eyes briefly, and then walked back to the station. She had learned a long time ago that the only people who told you to disappear were people who needed something from the space you occupied. She just hadn't figured out yet what Serena needed from her. It was on day 6 that she met Elliot. She had gone looking for a chart in the small administrative room at the end of the floor, and found a child instead, maybe 8 years old, sitting on the floor against the wall, with his knees pulled up, holding a tablet he wasn't looking at. He was small for his age, dark-haired, with the particular stillness of a child who had spent significant time in places where adults were doing things they didn't want him to see. He looked up when Mara came in. He didn't startle. He assessed. You're his nurse, the boy said. The one that's there in the mornings. I am, Mara said. She didn't move toward him. She stood at the door and let him decide what the distance should be. Are you Elliot? He looked at her carefully. How do you know my name? Your dad's chart has an emergency contact section, she said. Elliot Varelli, age 8. That's you, right? He looked back at his tablet. Yeah. Mara leaned against the doorframe. Do you know where you're supposed to be right now? The waiting room. A pause. It's boring. The waiting room usually is. There's a man in there who keeps looking at me, Elliot said. He said it without alarm, which was more alarming than if he'd been scared. He said it the way you state a weather condition. I don't know who he is. He's not one of the regular people. Mara looked at him. Something moved in her chest, not sympathy exactly. Recognition. Does he know your name, she asked. He said it when I came in. He said, hey, Elliot, your dad's going to be fine. But none of the regular people told him my name. I was watching. Mara was silent for 3 seconds. Okay, she said. You're going to stay here for a few minutes. I'll be right back. She found Celia at the station and spoke quietly. Within 4 minutes, the man in the waiting room had been located, identified as someone who had no legitimate reason to be on this floor, and escorted out by the 2 men in dark coats. Mara didn't know what happened after that and didn't ask. She went back to the administrative room. Elliot was still there. He's gone, she said. Elliot looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, still controlled, still careful, but with a small release in it, the way a muscle relaxes when it's been held too long. How'd you do that? He asked. I talked to the right people, she said. He thought about that. You're not scared of them, he said. The men in the coats. Most people who come in here are scared of them. I'm not most people, Mara said. She sat down against the opposite wall, cross-legged on the floor, and pulled out the chart she'd come for. Go ahead and watch your tablet. I've got some reading to do. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his tablet. They sat in comfortable silence for 20 minutes, which was more than either of them had expected. On day 9, Serena escalated. She arrived with a man Mara didn't recognize. Expensive suit, no hospital ID, the particular smoothness of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room he entered. He stood behind Serena while she spoke to the floor supervisor, and the conversation was quiet, but its outcome was not. The supervisor came to Mara at the end of the shift and said, with the careful, apologetic tone of someone delivering a message they wished they weren't carrying, that there had been a complaint, that certain family members had expressed concern about the quality of care, that perhaps it would be better if Mara's assignment was reconsidered. Mara listened. She said, was the complaint about something specific I did or didn't do? The supervisor couldn't meet her eyes. It's more of a general concern about fit. Fit, Mara repeated. I know this is difficult. I'd like to see the complaint in writing, Marissa said. And I'd like the patient's attending physician to be part of any conversation about reassignment. That's standard protocol. The supervisor looked like she'd been handed something she hadn't expected. I'll look into that, she said. Mara nodded and went back to work. She already knew the attending physician, who was careful, competent, and visibly uncomfortable with the politics of this floor, would not agree to a reassignment without documented clinical cause. She knew this because she had paid attention for 9 days. She knew it because paying attention was something she had been doing since she was 16 years old, and the alternative had been catastrophic. The complaint never became a formal reassignment. But something else happened that night. She was finishing her last chart note at 11:45 when the monitor in room 4 shifted pattern. Not alarms, nothing that dramatic, just a change in the rhythm she had been watching. For 9 days. A subtle alteration that meant something was different. She went in. Dante Varelli's eyes were open, not groggy, not confused, open and tracking, with the particular focused clarity of a man who had been somewhere else for a long time and had just arrived back. His gaze moved across the ceiling, then to the monitors, then to the door, and then to Mara, and it stopped there. She checked the monitors first, made the notation, and then came to the side of the bed. His vitals were elevated but stable. His pupils reacted correctly. She ran through the basic orientation check, and he responded to each one, not with words, not yet. His throat was too dry for that, but with blinks and micro-movements that told her exactly what she needed to know. He was back. He was oriented. He was in pain and managing it with the particular compressed stillness of someone who had long experience managing pain. She brought the water straw to his mouth and let him take a small sip. He swallowed. Then he looked at her again with those dark, direct eyes, and she saw the question in them, the obvious one. The first question, the one every person woke from something like this, asking. You've been unconscious for 9 days, she said. You're in a private ICU. The assassination attempt failed. You're stable. She kept her voice level and clinical because that was what he needed right now. Not warmth, not softness. Information. Your son is safe. Elliot is safe. Something happened in his face at that fractional change, a release so small that someone else might not have seen it. But she saw it. She pressed the call button to alert the on-call physician. She documented the time of consciousness. She did all the things she was trained to do. And Dante Varelli kept watching her, with that Same focused, unreadable attention, as if he was trying to figure out something about her that he couldn't quite resolve. Serena arrived the next morning at 7:45, ahead of her usual time. Someone had called her. Of course someone had called her. She came through the door of room 4 with her coat still on, her composure assembled but not quite settled, and she went directly to the bed and took Dante's hand and said something low and private that Mara, who was completing her morning chart work in the corner, wasn't meant to hear. Dante said something back. Mara didn't look up from the chart. Then Serena straightened and turned to the room and said, "You can go." Mara finished the notation she was making. "I'll need to complete the morning assessment first." I said, "You can go. He's awake. The emergency is over. You're not needed in this room." Dante said something. His voice was rough from the tube, still rough even now, abraded and low. Serena's expression shifted. Mara looked up. Dante was looking at her, not at Serena. He said it again, and this time she could make it out clearly. "What's your name?" Serena's hand tightened on the bed rail. It was a small movement, barely visible, but it was there. "Mara," she said. "Mara Ellison." He looked at her for a moment, the way he had looked at her last night, that same focused, assessing attention. Then he looked at Serena. "She stays," he said. Serena kept her expression arranged perfectly. "Dante, you've just woken up. You don't need to—" "She stays." He said it the same way the second time. No escalation. No anger. The kind of flat certainty that doesn't need either. The room went very still. Then Serena turned and looked at Mara, and behind the composed surface of her face, something showed that was not quite anger and not quite fear, and was possibly both. "Of course," Serena said. She sat in the chair beside the bed and folded her hands in her lap, and did not look at Mara again for the rest of the visit. Mara completed the morning assessment. She documented everything she needed to document. She left when she was finished. In the corridor, one of the men in dark coats was watching her. This time she didn't look away. She kept walking, her footsteps steady, her hands at her sides, her breathing even. She had learned long ago that the moment you showed someone you were rattled was the moment they understood exactly how to rattle you further. Something had shifted this morning. She could feel it in the quality of the silence around room 4, in the way the other nurses glanced at her, differently, in the way Serena's face had arranged itself a few degrees too carefully. Something had shifted, and whatever it was not going to make the next few days simpler. She stopped at the station and looked at the monitoring board. Room 4's vitals were steady, strong, even. Dante Varelli was awake and lucid, and he had said one sentence that rearranged the entire architecture of this floor. She stays. Mara had spent the last 9 days watching a man she was not supposed to know anything about, and she had made conclusions about him, the way she made conclusions about everything carefully, without sentiment, from evidence rather than impression. The evidence said he was controlled. It said he was strategic. It said that very little he did was accidental, which meant she needed to think carefully about why a man who had been unconscious for 9 days, who had a fiancée at his bedside, whose first priority should have been orientation and family, and the survival information she had already given him, why that man had made the deliberate choice to override the woman beside him in order to keep a nurse in the room. She looked at the board for another moment. Then she pulled up the chart and got back to work. Because thinking was something you could do while your hands were busy, and she had learned to do both at once a long time ago. Dante Varelli was not a patient who recovered quietly. By the second morning after waking, he was sitting upright without being asked, removing the oxygen monitor from his finger to look at it, and asking the attending physician questions that made clear he had no intention of being managed. Dr. Rourke answered them with the particular careful precision of a man who understood that some patients required information the way other patients required sedation, and that Dante Varelli was definitively the first kind. Vara observed this from the doorway during the morning rounds and made her own assessments. His color was better. His voice had lost the rasp. His eyes moved around the room with a restless, cataloging intelligence that told her he was already assembling a picture of where he was and what was happening around him, and that the picture he was building was not limited to his medical condition. She went in after Rourke left and did the vitals check she was there to do. Dante watched her work. not with the helpless attention of a sick man watching the person keeping him alive. Something more specific than that. Something that had weight and direction. "You're the one who found Elliot," he said. She didn't stop what she was doing. "He was in the administrative room. He found me, technically. He told me about the man in the waiting room." She wrote the blood pressure reading in the chart. There was someone on the floor who didn't belong there. It was handled. "By you. I spoke to the right people and they handled it." She moved to the next check. It wasn't anything complicated. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him thinking, not the way most people thought, which was visibly, with their expression doing the work, but internally, the conclusion already forming before any of it reached his face. He said, "You sat on the floor with him," Dante said. Mara looked up at that, just briefly. "He had his tablet," she said. "I had a chart. It worked out." Dante looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not gratitude, it was too complicated for gratitude. Something more conflicted than that, as if the information he was receiving didn't fit cleanly into any framework he already had for the world. "What do you want?" he asked. The directness of it was almost refreshing. Almost. "To finish the morning assessment," she said. "It's not what I mean. I know what you mean." She completed the final notation and closed the chart. "And the answer is nothing. I don't want anything from you. I'm here to do a job." She met his eyes once level and direct. "I'd actually prefer if things stayed that way." She left before he could respond. In the corridor, she exhaled once through her nose and kept walking. She would prefer things stayed that way. She had meant it completely, but she was not naive enough to believe that preference was going to be sufficient, because the way Dante Varelli had just looked at her was the look of a man who had decided she was interesting, and interesting was a dangerous thing, to be inside the orbit of a man like him. Serena came that afternoon with flowers, not for Dante. She brought flowers for the nursing station, an extravagant arrangement, white and architectural, the kind of thing that cost more than Mara made in a shift. She set them on the counter herself, smiled at the nurses, and said something gracious about how hard they all worked, and how much the family appreciated it. Then she turned to Mara and said, in a tone that had no edge to it at all, which was somehow worse than if it had, "Could I speak with you privately? Just for a moment." They went to the small consultation alcove at the end of the floor. Serena stood near the window, her coat over her arm, her expression composed to something that resembled genuine concern so closely that if you hadn't been watching her for 11 days, you might have believed it. "I want to apologize," Serena said, "for the way I spoke to you when you first started. I was frightened. I was frightened. I took it out on people who didn't deserve it." Mara waited. "I know I came across as difficult," Serena continued, "and I know that wasn't fair. You've clearly done an excellent job. Dante speaks highly of you." A small practiced pause. Perhaps too highly. There it was. "I'm not sure what you mean," Mara said. Serena looked at her with an expression that was patient and generous and absolutely deliberate. "I mean that Dante is a man who forms attachments to people who are useful to him. Pattern. He latches on to whoever is present. During a crisis, it's psychological. It makes sense, I understand. But those attachments can sometimes be misread." She tilted her head. "By the people he attaches to." "I don't think I've misread anything," Mara said. "I'm sure you haven't." Serena smiled. "I just thought it was worth mentioning. Professionally." She left. The flowers stayed at the nursing station, white and expensive and impossible to ignore. Mara went back to work. Celia appeared at her shoulder 20 minutes later, not looking at her, both of them facing the monitoring board. Whatever she said in there, Celia said quietly, "Believe the opposite." "I know," Mara said. "She's done this before. The apology routine. It means she's decided you're enough of a threat to require management instead of just consent." Mara looked at the monitoring board. "Good," she said, and she surprised herself because she meant it. On the third day after Dante's waking, she recognized the symbol. It was on the inside of a folder that one of Dante's associates left on the visitor's chair. In room 4, a man named Tavio, broad-shouldered and quiet, came each afternoon for 20 minutes and spoke to Dante in low tones that Mara was not meant to hear. She wasn't trying to see the folder. She came in for the afternoon check while Tavio was still there, and he moved the folder from the chair to the table, and it fell open, and the page inside had a header printed in the upper corner. circular mark, 3 lines through it. A specific arrangement she had seen before, not like a logo exactly, more like a watermark, the kind of thing that wasn't meant to be noticed by anyone who didn't already know what it meant. Mara knew what it meant. Her hands performed the blood pressure check without variation. Her expression did not change. She documented the reading and left the room, and walked directly to the supply closet at the end of the hall, where she stood alone for exactly 60 seconds, with her back against the metal shelving and her eyes on the ceiling, breathing carefully. She had last seen that symbol when she was 19 years old. It had been on a document in a lawyer's office, not her lawyer. The other one, the one who sat across the table and explained in very precise terms why her family's complaint against certain party would not be moving forward, and why pursuing it further would be unwise, and what unwise sometimes meant. Her father had nodded and taken her hand, and they had walked out into a city that had suddenly felt different, not larger, exactly, but full of more unmarked doors than she had previously understood were there. She breathed for 60 seconds. Then she went back to work. At night, she did research she knew she shouldn't do. She sat in her apartment with her laptop, and her remaining notes from years ago, she had kept them, not because she thought she would ever need them, but because destroying them had felt like surrendering something she wasn't ready to surrender. And she cross-referenced what she had with what she could find. The symbol appeared in 3 places that she could document. A holding company registered in Delaware with no public officers. A shipping contract that had been part of a civil case in federal court 7 years ago, settled before discovery. And a property transfer in the county records that involved a name she recognized because it had been in the news 2 years ago, when a city council member had abruptly resigned and moved to another state. The Varelli name did not appear in any of these documents directly, but the shipping contracts did, and the timing overlapped in ways she could not yet make definitive with the period when her father's business had been systematically dismantled by people at Holt and then found he couldn't fight. She sat at her kitchen table until 2 in the morning. She was not angry yet. Anger required certainty, and she didn't have certainty. What she had was a thread, and pulling threads in situations like this was something you did very carefully or not at all. Closed the laptop. She went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about Elliot, sitting on the floor against the wall, holding a tablet he wasn't watching, assessing her with those careful eyes. She thought about Dante saying she stays in a voice that had no argument left in it. She thought about what it meant that she was connected, even by something as thin as a symbol on a folder, to the same network that had taken everything her family had and left them with nothing. She didn't sleep for a long time. In the morning, Dante asked her to stay after the vitals check. She stood at the door and said, "I have other patients." 5 minutes, he said. She turned back. She stood near the door, which was deliberate and which he noticed. "Tavio tells me someone ran a background search on me through a non-standard channel 2 nights ago," he said. "From a residential IP. The search was careful. Whoever ran it knew what to look for and knew which databases not to use." He watched her. That's not the behavior of a curious person. That's the behavior of someone with specific questions. Mara felt her heartbeat in her throat. She didn't let it show. "What does that have to do with me?" she said. "Probably nothing," he said. "Except you're the only person on this floor who I've had a reason to think is something other than exactly what she appears to be." He wasn't accusing her. He was doing something more unsettling than that. He was being direct and level and watching her the way she watched everything from evidence. "I'm not angry about the search. I'm telling you, because I want you to know that I notice things." "I'd noticed that," Mara said. A beat of silence. "Who are you?" he asked. Not what's your name. Not where are you from. Something underneath that. Something that was asking about the version of herself that had stayed very still for 9 years and had not been asked about directly. "I'm a nurse," she said. "That's the truth. Whatever else you think you've found, this isn't a con, and I'm not here for any reason except the one on my assignment papers." "I believe you," he said. He said it without hesitation, which surprised her. That doesn't mean there isn't more to it. She looked at him for a moment, the man in the bed, who was supposed to be the most feared person in this city, who was watching her with dark, direct eyes, and had just told her he believed her in the same breath as noting that belief wasn't the whole story. "Get some rest," she said. "Your blood pressure is still elevated." She left. Her hands were shaking slightly by the time she reached the supply room, and she stood there and made them stop through the simple discipline of pressing them flat against her thighs and breathing until they settled. He was watching her now, really watching her. And she was holding information about his organization that she didn't know what to do with. And somewhere in this building was a woman who had specifically arranged for Mara to be here, and she still didn't know why. Found out why on a Thursday. Celia came to her at the end of the shift with a look that she had not seen on Celia's face before, not alarm exactly, but the cousin of it. The look of someone who has discovered that the floor she thought was stable has a seam running through it. "Someone talked to HR, Celia said. "There's a complaint filed. It says you've been accessing non-patient records, that you've been going through administrative files that you have no reason to access." Mara was very still. "I've accessed nothing outside my assigned caseload," she said. "I know that, but the complaint is filed, and it's specific. It cites dates and times." Celia paused. "The dates and times it cites are real. You were in the building during those times. The records it claims you accessed, I didn't access them." "I know." Celia looked at her steadily. "But someone has logs that say you did, which means someone went into the system and created access records that point to your credentials." The weight of it settled over Mara slowly and completely. "Someone built a file on me," she said. "Someone built a file on you," Celia confirmed. "And whoever did it has administrative access to the hospital system and enough knowledge of how the logging works to make it look real." Mara thought about Serena's apology, the flowers on the counter, pleasant voice, and the carefully arranged concern. "I just thought it was worth mentioning. Professionally, when does HR want to meet?" Mara asked. "Monday," Celia said, "which gives you the weekend." Mara nodded. "There's one more thing," Celia said, and something in her voice made Mara look at her with full attention. Complaint wasn't filed by Serena. It was filed by someone in hospital administration. Someone with the title of Deputy Compliance Officer. She paused. "That position has been vacant for 2 years. Someone created the profile to file the complaint, and then the profile goes inactive." Mara stood at the nursing station and looked at the monitoring board. Room 4 was steady. Dante's vitals were even and strong. Whoever had built the false access logs had done it carefully enough to use a fabricated employee profile. That was not the work of a vengeful fiancé acting alone. That was infrastructure. That was the kind of thing you built when you had time and resources and a specific outcome in mind. Serena had requested her assignment specifically through the temp agency 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, Dante Varelli had still been in a coma, which meant Serena had chosen Mara before Dante woke up, before he said she stays, before any of the specific tensions of the last 4 days had emerged. Serena had chosen her for a reason that predated all of this. And Mara, who had spent 9 years being very careful about what she let herself follow, felt the particular cold clarity of understanding that she was not a bystander in whatever was happening here. She was already inside it. She had been inside it before she walked through the door. Mara spent Friday night building a counterfile. She did it the way she did everything that mattered, methodically, without rushing, without the kind of anger that made people sloppy. She sat at her kitchen table with her personal laptop and the notes she had kept in for 9 years, and what she could reconstruct from memory about the access logs she had legitimately used during her assignment, and she documented each one with timestamps cross-referenced against the patient chart notations that would confirm her location and activity at every relevant moment. It wasn't a defense yet. It was a foundation. The difference mattered. She worked until 1 in the morning. Then she stopped, made tea she didn't drink, and sat looking at the wall. Serena had chosen her specifically. 3 weeks before Dante woke up, before any of the particular friction of the last week had developed, Serena had gone through a temp agency list and selected Mara Ellison out of 12 available nurses. That selection had to have been based on something. You didn't build fake compliance records and fabricate employee profiles over a general dislike. That kind of infrastructure required specific motivation, which meant Serena knew something about Mara before Mara walked through the door. Question was what? And the question after that was how. She had rebuilt her life carefully. New city, new credentials, legitimate ones. She had actually gone to nursing school, had actually graduated, had actually passed every exam. She had changed nothing about her legal identity because changing your legal identity left a scar that was more visible than the original wound. She had simply moved and worked and kept her head down and let the years accumulate between herself and what had happened. But someone had found the thread. She picked up her phone and looked at it for a long time. Then she put it down. There was no one she could call about this. That was the specific particular loneliness of the life she had built. It was solid and functional, and almost entirely without people who knew the version of her that existed before she became Mara Ellison, the nurse. Her parents were gone. Her father 2 years after the collapse, her mother a year after that, both of them dismantled by what had been taken from them, as thoroughly as if they'd been physically disassembled. She had a cousin in another state who she spoke to twice a year and who knew nothing. She was alone with this. She had been alone with it for 9 years. She went to bed. Saturday, she went to the hospital not because she was scheduled, but because she needed to think in a place where her hands had something to do. She told the charge nurse she was covering for a colleague and spent 3 hours doing work that didn't require her presence while her mind ran the problem from every angle she could find. Elliot was in the family waiting room when she passed it at noon. He was alone. Again. No tablet this time, he was just sitting, looking at his shoes, with the particular kind of stillness that 8-year-olds only achieved when something was pressing on them that they didn't have language for yet. Mara stopped at the door. "Where's your babysitter?" He looked up. Something in his face opened slightly the way it did. She had noticed when she appeared. She had to take a call. She's been on the phone for a long time. Mara came in and sat across from him. "Is something wrong?" He looked at her with those assessing eyes. "My dad's being discharged," he said. "They're moving him home today." She hadn't known that. She should have known that it should have been in the morning handover notes. But she hadn't been at the morning handover because she wasn't scheduled and had come in through the back route. And the charge nurse she'd spoken to hadn't mentioned it. "That's good news," she said carefully. "He's recovered enough to go home. Serena is going to be there," Elliot said. He said it the same way he'd said. "The man in the waiting room knew my name, like a weather condition, like something he had noted and filed, and was not sure what to do with." "She's his fiancée," Mara said. Elliot looked at his shoes again. "Doesn't like me." Mara didn't say anything reassuring. He was 8 and perceptive, and false reassurance would register as exactly that. "She doesn't know you very well," Mara said instead. "She's known me for 2 years. He said it without complaint. Just the flat factual weight of it. "She talks to me like I'm furniture she didn't pick." Mara felt something move in her chest that she kept off her face. "Your dad knows you," she said. "That's the one that counts." Elliot looked at her. "Are you going to keep working here after he goes home?" Question landed in a place she hadn't expected. She held it for a moment before answering. "My assignment was to this floor," she said. "So probably not." He nodded like he had expected that. He went back to looking at his shoes. She sat with him until the babysitter came back, phone still in hand, apologizing without making eye contact. Mara watched the woman take Elliot's hand and lead him toward the elevator, and she watched Elliot look back at her once, before the elevator doors closed. She stood in the empty waiting room for a moment. Then she went to check the discharge paperwork, because something in the back of her mind had started pulling at her about the timing the discharge happening today, a Saturday, when it could easily have waited until Monday, and she had learned to follow that kind of pull. The discharge papers had been signed by Dr. Rourke at 9 that morning. The request for early discharge had come from the family, standard enough. But Mara stood at the nursing station and looked at the paperwork and felt the pull getting stronger, more insistent, because 3 things were sitting next to each other in her mind, and she couldn't make them fit into an innocent arrangement. 1. Serena had built a false compliance file that would be presented to HR on Monday. 2. Dante was being discharged today, Saturday, 2 days before that meeting. 3. Once Dante was home, inside the Varelli estate, Mara had no access to him, no legitimate reason to be present, no professional cover for anything she said or saw or reported. Whatever she had observed. From inside this floor, the symbol on the folder, patterns of visitors, the things she had assembled, became significantly harder to act on once she was removed from this environment. The discharge wasn't just about getting Dante home. It was about removing Mara from the only position she had. She pulled out her phone. She looked at the notes she had made over the past 2 weeks. She made a decision that she understood was going to have consequences she couldn't fully predict, and she made it anyway because the alternative was to walk away. And she had done that once before, and it had cost her everything. She went to room 4. Dante was dressed, which startled her. She had seen him in a hospital gown for 11 days, and the shift was disorienting. The gray shirt and dark pants making him look more like the man in the news photographs and less like the patient she had been managing. He was standing near the window talking to Tavio in a low voice that stopped when she came in. "I need to speak with you," she said. "Alone." Dante looked at Tavio. Tavio left without a word and closed the door. Mara stood in the center of the room and did not waste either of their time. "Serena filed a fabricated compliance complaint against me at this hospital," she said. "It cites access records that someone created using my credentials. It's designed to have me removed from any nursing position that would give me access to your medical information or your family's movements." She watched him. His expression had gone still in the way she recognized now internal processing, nothing wasted on the surface. "I think she arranged my assignment here deliberately. I don't know everything she knew about me before I arrived, but she knew something. And whatever she built the complaint around, she built it before you woke up. Which means it wasn't a response to the last week. It was already in motion." Dante was looking at her with that same focused, unreadable attention. "What do you want me to do about it?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "I'm not here to ask you for help. I'm telling you because there's something else." She took a breath. 11 days ago, I saw a symbol on a document in this room. Specific mark on a folder Tavio brought in. She described it. Dante's expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted, subtle and complete. "I've seen that symbol before. 9 years ago. It was connected to a network of companies that systematically dismantled my family's business and my father's reputation, and then made it legally impossible to pursue any complaint against them." She kept her voice even. "I don't have proof of what the connection is. I have the symbol, and I have the timing, and I have 9 years of careful documentation of what I can demonstrate." She paused. "I'm telling you so you know what I know. And so you know that I'm not going to pretend I didn't see it." The room was very quiet. "Sit down," Dante said. "I'll stand." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed to the chair by the window and sat himself, which she understood was an acknowledgement of her position, rather than an indication of weakness. "That symbol," he said. "Where specifically did you see it?" "On the document. Upper right corner. Printed, not stamped. Small, maybe half an inch." "What color?" "Dark blue, almost black." He was quiet. He put his hand flat on the arm of the chair and looked at it. "That mark belongs to a holding structure," he said slowly. "One that I inherited when I took over certain operations from my uncle 8 years ago. I've been in the process of dismantling it for the last 2 years. Companies under it are being restructured." He looked up at her. "My uncle Raphael managed those operations for 15 years before I took control. I don't have complete records of everything that moved through those structures during that time." Mara stood very still. "Your family's name," Dante said. "What was the business?" She told him. She watched the information land. She watched him process it with the same internal discipline she recognized, because she used it herself. She watched him reach a conclusion, and then check it, and then reach it again. "I need to make a call," he said. He said it quietly. He was not performing composure, he was genuinely thinking. "Give me an hour." "I'm not going to be here in an hour," she said. "My access to this floor ends when you leave. Then give me your number." She stood at the door and looked at him, the man who was possibly connected to the worst thing that had ever happened to her, sitting in a chair with his hand flat on the armrest, and his eyes carrying something that looked, against all her expectations, like it might be genuine. She gave him her number. She left. She was in the parking lot, sitting in her car with the engine off, when her phone rang. Not Dante, a number she didn't recognize. She answered it because not answering felt like the wrong move. The voice on the other end was male, calm, and specific. Said her name, her full name, not her current name, her original name, the name she had not used in 9 years, and said it without inflection, without threat, just as a demonstration. "We know you've been looking," the voice said. "We know what you found at the hospital. We know about the notes you've kept." Mara's hand tightened on the phone. She kept her breathing even. "We're not your enemy," the voice said. "We have a common interest in what happens to Raffaele Varelli. We'd like to meet." "Who is this?" she said. "Someone who has been watching the Varelli organization for 3 years. Someone who has documentation you don't have, and who needs documentation you do." A pause. "Someone who knows exactly what Raphael's network did. To your family, Miss..." And then the voice used her original name again, deliberate and precise. "Where?" she said. The voice gave her an address. A coffee shop, public, 15 minutes away. Sunday morning, 10 o'clock. The line went dead. Mara sat in the parking lot and looked at the steering wheel. Someone had her real name. Someone had known she was looking before she had confirmed to anyone that she was. Someone had been watching the Varelli organization for 3 years, which meant they had been watching it before Dante was shot, before Serena arranged her assignment, before any of what she thought of as the beginning of this situation, which meant she was not at the beginning. She was in the middle of something that had been running without her for a long time. Started the car. The coffee shop was ordinary. Sunday morning ordinary families with strollers, a line at the counter, the smell of burnt espresso and warm pastry. Mara arrived 8 minutes early and took a table facing the door, which was the only table she would have taken, and ordered coffee she intended to drink, because having something in her hands helped her think. The man who sat down across from her at 9:58 was not what she had imagined from the voice. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, compact, with the careful posture of someone who had spent significant time in institutional environments. He was wearing a jacket that didn't quite fit his shoulders and carrying nothing, no briefcase, no phone visible, no folder. He said his name was Garrett. He put a small recorder on the table between them, which she had not expected. "Everything I tell you, I'm on record for," he said. "I want you to know that up front." "Why?" she said. "Because the last 3 years of my life have been devoted to building a case that I cannot present without a witness who can corroborate the internal pattern from the inside." He looked at her steadily. "You're the inside. You didn't know that, but you are." "Who do you work for?" she said. "Currently, nobody. Previously, Federal Organized Crime Task Force. I resigned 14 months ago over the handling of the Varelli investigation." He paused. "They were going to close it. I wasn't." Mara looked at him. "Why were they going to close it?" He reached into his jacket slowly, which she noted he did deliberately, and put a single photograph on the table. It was an interior shot, a meeting room, several men around a table. One of them she recognized as Raffaele Varelli from the hospital visitor logs she had memorized. One of them she did not recognize. One of them was wearing a federal agency lanyard, because someone inside the investigation was feeding information to Raphael, Garrett said. "And when I identified who it was, I was told my methodology was flawed and my conclusions were unsupported. And 2 weeks later, my security clearance was under review." He picked the photograph back up. "Raffaele Varelli has been running a parallel operation to Dante's for 11 years, not competing parallel. Dante built the legitimate front. Raphael used it as cover for the trafficking routes, the document forgery network, the financial manipulation that destroyed dozens of businesses in this city." He looked at her. "Including your father's." Mara set her coffee cup down. "Your father found the shell company connection," Garrett said. "He didn't know what he'd found, but he found it. And he started asking questions through a lawyer who didn't know enough to keep quiet. Raphael's people found out within 6 weeks. The rest of what happened to your family was deliberate and systematic, and I can document every step of it." The noise of the coffee shop continued around them. The stroller family, the line at the counter, the ordinary Sunday morning of people who were not sitting at this table. Mara looked at the table surface. She had spent 9 years believing that what had happened to her family was a combination of deliberate cruelty and legal machinery that had simply been beyond their ability to fight. She had rebuilt herself around that belief, around the knowledge that powerful people could destroy ordinary ones and face no consequence, and that the only rational response was to become someone who could not be easily destroyed. She had not allowed herself to believe it could be undone. "What do you need from me?" she said. Her voice was level. She was proud of that. "Your documentation," Garrett said, "and your testimony about what you observed inside that hospital. The symbol you saw, that's a connection I can use. That folder was from a Raphael-controlled company that Dante doesn't know exists. I can tie it to 3 separate instances of evidence tampering." He leaned forward slightly. "And I need you to go back in." She looked at him. "The estate," he said. "Dante's discharged today. Raphael will be at the house within 48 hours. He always visits after a family crisis. It's part of how he maintains his position. There's a room on the lower level of that estate where Raphael has been conducting meetings that aren't in any of Dante's records. I need someone inside that house who can confirm the room exists and document its access point. Everything else I have will fold without it." "I'm a nurse," Mara said. "I have no reason to be inside that house." "Dante Varelli just asked his assistant to contact your temp agency about arranging home care for his recovery," Garrett said. "The request went through 20 minutes ago. His physician recommended it." He looked at her. "You have every reason to be inside that house. Whether you take it is your decision." Mara sat at the table in the ordinary Sunday morning coffee shop and looked at the man across from her who had spent 3 years building a case alone after the institution he worked for had been compromised. She understood something that she had been circling for 2 days without landing on it directly. She had been brought into this by Serena's manipulation. Path forward was not about Serena at all. It was about Raphael. And the evidence that could dismantle what had been done to her family was sitting inside a house she had just been legitimately invited to enter. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was a message from a number she had given to only one person in the last 24 hours. It said, "I found the records from your father's company. We need to talk. I'm sorry." 3 words at the end of that message. 3 words from a man who did not strike her as someone who said them easily or often, and they landed somewhere in her chest with a weight she was not prepared for. Dante had found the records. He had looked, and he had apologized, which meant he had also confirmed it, which meant everything she had suspected was true, and the man who had just been discharged from the hospital she worked in was connected, even by the distance of an uncle he may not have controlled, to the systematic destruction of everything she had spent her childhood inside of. Mara looked at Garrett. "Tell me exactly what you need me to document," she said. Her hands were not shaking. She had made them stop the way she always made them stop, through the discipline of deciding that the thing in front of her mattered more than what it cost her. She was going into the Varelli estate. She was going in, carrying the weight of 9 years and a confirmation she had not been ready to receive, and she was going to do it with steady hands and a clear head, because that was the only way any of this ended in a direction she could live with. What she did not know yet, could not know, was that the moment she walked through the gates of that estate, the person who had arranged her original assignment, and the person who had been dismantling the case from the inside, and the person she had just agreed to help were all about to discover that Mara Ellison was not. The variable any of them had accurately calculated. She was the only one who had seen all of it from the inside, and she had been taking notes since the day she arrived. The Varelli estate was not what Mara had imagined. She had imagined something deliberately imposing the architecture of intimidation, the kind of house that announced its owner's power in every vertical line and locked gate. What she found instead was a property that had the particular quality of a place that had once been a family home and had been converted over years into something else, something functional and fortified, without anyone ever quite finishing the conversion. There were roses along the east wall that someone still tended. There was a basketball hoop in the side courtyard that had not been taken down, and from the worn patch of asphalt beneath it had not been ignored either. Elliot's, she guessed. She arrived Monday morning at 9 with a medical bag and the paperwork from the temp agency confirming her assignment as home recovery nurse for Dante Varelli, and she was met at the gate by a man who checked her credentials with the particular thoroughness of someone who had been given specific instructions to be thorough. Took her bag, checked it, gave it back, and walked her to the door without speaking. The housekeeper who met her inside was a woman in her 60s named Dora, who had the efficiently warm manner of someone who had managed a complicated household for a long time and had developed strong opinions about who was useful and who was not. She assessed Mara in approximately 4 seconds and appeared to reach a provisional conclusion that was not unfavorable. "He's in the study," Dora said. "He won't stay in the bedroom. We've had that argument twice already." "How long has he been up?" Mara asked. "Since 6. Has he eaten?" "Coffee," Dora said, with the tone of someone reporting a crime. Mara followed her through the house and catalogued what she passed, the way she always catalogued things, not looking directly, not pausing, just absorbing. The layout was larger than it appeared from outside. The ground floor had a long central corridor, with rooms branching off each side. Far end a staircase. To the left of the staircase, a shorter corridor that ended at a door that was different from the others, heavier, with a different handle, the particular look of a door that opened onto stairs, going down. She noted it and kept walking. The study was at the front of the house, high-ceilinged, and book-lined in the way of rooms where the books were actually used. Dante was behind the desk with a phone in his hand and 3 open laptops, which was either impressive or alarming for a man who had been in a coma 11 days ago, and Mara decided it was both. He looked up when she came in. "You came," he said. "I said I would," she said. She set her bag on the chair across from the desk and looked at him clinically. He was pale beneath the color he was recovering. There were shadows under his eyes that spoke to a night spent not sleeping. "You look terrible." "Good morning to you too. Have you taken your medication?" "I was going to no." She opened the bag. "Sit back." He sat back, which she had not entirely expected, and watched her with those dark, steady eyes while she did the vitals check with the same efficiency she had used for 11 days in the hospital. The familiarity of the routine, creating a strange domesticity in the middle of everything that was not domestic about this situation. "Text," she said while she worked. "Last night. I know. I need you to tell me what you found." He was quiet for long enough that she looked up from the blood pressure cuff. "Raphael managed a network of shell companies that I knew existed in a general sense, but did not have operational detail on," he said. "He told me they were legacy structures from before my father's time. They were being wound down. I believed him because I had no specific reason not to, and because I was focused on other things." His voice was flat, not self-excusing. "What I found in the records last night, what Tavio pulled, is that those structures were active until 14 months ago. Not being wound down, active." He paused. "The company that bought your father's primary contracts at auction, after the bankruptcy, it's in that network." Mara kept her eyes on the monitor. "He bought them for 11 cents on the dollar," Dante said, "through 4 layers of intermediaries, and then he sold the contracts 2 years later for a number I'm not going to say out loud, because it will make you angry in a way that won't be productive right now." Her jaw was tight. She made it relax. "I didn't know," Dante said. "I want to be clear about that, and I also want to be clear that I understand that me not knowing doesn't change what happened to your family." "No," she said, "it doesn't." The room was quiet. "What do you need?" he said. She looked at him. Then really looked at him, the way she had been careful not to do in the hospital, because looking at someone carefully was the beginning of caring about them, and she had not wanted to care about anything in this house. He was looking back at her with the same directness, the same absence of performance, that she had been reading as his one consistent quality since the night he woke up. "I need access to the lower level of this house," she said. Something changed in his face. "Not alarm calculation. The archive room," he said. "Is that what it is?" "That's what Raphael told me it was." He said it with the particular weight of a man who was revising every assumption he had applied to a person he trusted. "I haven't been down there in 2 years. Raphael managed the access. There's someone outside this organization who has been building a case against Raphael for 3 years, Mara said. He was federal. He has documentation that needs one corroborating piece: physical confirmation of a room in this house and its access point. She held his gaze. I told him I'd get it. Dante was very still. "You went outside," he said. "Yes, before talking to me." "I didn't know if I could trust you," she said. "I still don't know with certainty. But you found those records, and you texted me at midnight, and you said you were sorry, and that's more than I had reason to expect." She let that sit. "His name is Garrett. He resigned from the task force 14 months ago because someone inside was feeding information to Raphael. He needs what's in that room to close the case." Dante looked at the desk surface. He put his hand flat on it. The same gesture she had seen in the hospital, she realized. The same particular way of grounding himself physically while his mind ran somewhere faster. Raphael is coming today, he said quietly. He called this morning. Comes after every family crisis. Always has. He looked up. If he finds out you have access to that room, he won't find out from me. Dante nodded once. He stood up from the desk, which cost him something. She could see it in the compression of his mouth. The way his hand went briefly to his side, and he moved to the door. Come with me, he said. The stairs behind the heavy door went down 2 levels, not 1. The first level was storage archived documents, equipment cases, the kind of orderly accumulation of a household that had existed for decades. The second level was different. It was a room that had been built to be unnoticed. Not a hidden room exactly, it appeared in the house plans. Dante told her as mechanical space. The walls were reinforced, and the ventilation was independent, and there were data ports along one wall that were not connected to the house's main network. Mara stood in the doorway and looked at it. She took out her phone and documented the access point, the door, the room dimensions, the data ports. She noted the model numbers on the equipment cases against the wall. Garrett had given her a list of 3 specific serial numbers to look for, if possible. The second case she checked had 2 of them. She photographed everything she needed in 4 minutes. She was moving back toward the stairs when she heard the front door of the house open above them. Dante's hand closed on her arm, not hard, just immediate. He looked toward the stairs. She heard Dora's voice, and then a man's voice, and then footsteps. He's early, Dante said, very quiet. Stay here. I'm not stay here, he said again, and something in his voice was not a command and not a request, but something in between that she recognized as fear being managed into instruction. He was afraid of what Raphael would do if he found her down here, and he was not wrong to be afraid of it. Stayed. She listened to Dante go up the stairs. She listened to the door close. She stood in the room that Raphael Varela had built inside his nephew's house without his nephew's knowledge and looked at the walls and thought very carefully about what she did next. She sent Garrett the photographs. She sent them with a message that said, "He's here. I'm inside. Don't move yet." Garrett's response came in 12 seconds. Don't engage. Get out of the house. She looked at the message. Then she put the phone in her pocket. She could hear voices above her, through the floor. Not words, the house insulation was too good for that, but the particular rhythm of 2 men in a conversation that had tension in it. Dante's voice, lower. Raphael's, with a cadence she recognized as the kind of voice that asked questions that were not questions. Counted the minutes. At minute 7, the voices stopped. Minute 9, the door above opened. The footsteps on the stairs were not Dante's. Raphael Varela was 61 years old, and he had the build of a man who had once been physically formidable and had converted that physicality into something more economical, with age compact, contained, kind of stillness that in younger men read as potential energy and in older men read as experience with what that energy could do. He stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at Mara without surprise, which was itself the most frightening thing about him. He had known she was here. Someone had told him she was here, or he had been told she was coming, or he had arrived early specifically because he knew. Nurse Ellison, he said. He said it pleasantly. Mara was standing near the equipment cases. She had not moved when she heard the footsteps. He had not moved because moving would have told him something, and she did not want to tell him anything she didn't choose to give. Mr. Varela, she said. He came down the last 2 steps and looked around the room with the proprietary ease of a man surveying something he considered his. He looked at the equipment cases. He looked at the data ports. He looked at Mara. Dante tells me you're here for his recovery, Raphael said. I find that interesting. It's a straightforward assignment, she said. I'm sure it is. He moved toward the far wall, not toward her, a deliberate choice. She recognized the kind of positioning that made a room feel smaller without requiring proximity. I'm also sure that you're a very thorough nurse, very observant. He said it without inflection. I've heard a great deal about you over the last 2 weeks. Serena finds you remarkable. That's flattering, Mara said. It isn't meant to be. He turned and looked at her. What have you photographed? The question was direct and casual in the way of someone who already knew the answer. Mara held his gaze. Her pulse was elevated. She didn't let it into her hands or her face. I don't know what you mean, she said. Your phone has been out since you came downstairs? Raphael said. The network here is isolated, but it's still monitored. I received an alert 11 minutes ago that a device accessed the external relay. He tilted his head. You sent something to someone. He looked at her with the patient, curious attention of a man who was not worried, which was worse than if he had been. Who did you send it to? The door at the top of the stairs opened again. Dante came through it fast, not running, but fast, the controlled urgency of a man who had understood something and acted on it immediately. He came down the stairs and put himself between Raphael and Mara, which was not a gesture she had expected, which landed somewhere in her chest and lodged there. She's here because I asked her to be here, Dante said. Raphael looked at his nephew. Something moved in his expression that Mara couldn't entirely read. It was too layered, too old. The look of a man who had been managing this particular relationship for a very long time. Dante, Raphael said. What has she told you? Enough, Dante said. The words sat in the room. Raphael looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Mara. Then he looked at his nephew again, with the particular weariness of a man abandoning a position he had held for years, because the defense of it had finally become more expensive than the retreat. How long? Raphael said. I don't know yet, Dante said. That's what we're going to talk about. Raphael said. He looked at Mara, with her in the room. She stays, Dante said. Those two words again. The same words from the hospital, the same flat certainty. And this time Mara understood that they were not a statement about her. Specifically, they were a statement about the kind of man Dante had decided in this moment to be. Raphael's expression changed. Not dramatically, not with anger or panic, with something that was almost resignation, and beneath the resignation, the particular look of a man who had been waiting for a specific outcome for years, and had always known, somewhere underneath his plans, that it was coming. He sat down on one of the equipment cases, and then he told them in the flat, specific voice of a man reciting a document, which was what it was, the document of the last 15 years, assembled in his memory with the precision of someone who had needed to keep it clear because the details mattered. He told them about the shell company and the shipping routes. He told them about the arrangement with Serena's father, Aldrich Valmont, who had wanted control of the port contracts and had offered Raphael the financial structures to fund his parallel operation, in exchange for Dante's signature on agreements Dante had not fully read. He told them about the federal contact, a name, which Mara noted, who had been receiving payments through a real estate holding in another state for 11 years. He told them about her father. He told it without particular feeling, which was the hardest part to sit through. He said that her father's company had intersected with a supply chain that Raphael was using, and that her father had asked the wrong questions of the wrong lawyer, and that removing the company had been a practical local decision, not a personal one. He said this as if practical and personal were categories that had clear boundaries between them, as if the practical dismantling of a family was a different kind of act from any other kind. Mara stood behind Dante and listened. She had her hands at her sides. She was pressing her fingernails into her palms, not hard enough to break skin, just hard enough to give the anger somewhere to go that wasn't her face. When Raphael finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then Dante said, "Where is Elliot?" Raphael frowned. "With Dora, I assume." "Why?" Dante was already on his phone. Called Dora. The call connected and disconnected in 3 seconds, and something in his face went very still and very cold, in a way that Mara had not seen before, not the managed stillness of the hospital, not the deliberate composure of the last 2 days, but the particular absence of expression that comes when the thing you most feared has just been confirmed. He called Tavio. A brief exchange she couldn't hear the other end of. He looked at Raphael. "Where is Elliot?" he said again. and this time the question was not a question. Raphael's expression shifted, and for the first time in the conversation, he looked at his nephew with something that was not calculation that was, Mara realized, something that might have been genuine alarm. "He's in the house," Raphael said. "He was here when I arrived." "He's not in the house," Dante said. The room changed. Not physically, the walls were where they had been, the equipment cases, the data ports. But the temperature of it changed, the atmosphere of it, the particular quality, of a situation that has been one kind of emergency and has just become a different and more immediate one. Mara's phone buzzed. She looked at it. Garrett Aldrich Valmont's security team entered the city 40 minutes ago. 3 vehicles. We've been tracking them. I tried to reach you, Mara. They're going to the estate. And then the second message, already waiting behind the first. They're not coming for Dante. Check on the child. Mara looked at Dante. It's not Raphael, she said. Valmont, Serena's father. She turned the phone so he could see the messages. He's already here. Dante read the messages. She watched him read them. She watched his face do the thing it did when information landed, the brief internal processing, the conclusion forming. And this time, what came out the other side of it was not composure. It was something rawer than that, something she had not seen from him before and recognized immediately, because she had felt it herself at 19 years old, standing outside a lawyer's office with her father's hand in hers. It was the look of a man understanding that someone had found the thing he could not replace, and had put a hand on it. The service corridor, Mara said. She said it before she had fully decided to say it, before she had fully processed what she was committing to. Off the kitchen, I saw it when Dora walked me in. It exits to the east side of the property. If they brought him in from outside, they'd use the east approach, because the cameras there are on the same network as Raphael's equipment, which means, she looked at Raphael, which means you can loop them, she said. You've been doing it. Raphael stood up slowly. The man who had been reciting the document of 15 years was gone. What was left was older and more complicated, and not, she thought, entirely without shame. Yes, he said quietly. I can loop them. Dante looked at his uncle for one long moment. Then he said, do it, and then you're going to stay in this room until I come back for you. He moved toward the stairs. Mara was a half step behind him. He stopped, turned, looked at her with those dark eyes. And this time what was in them was not assessment or calculation or any of the things she had cataloged from him. It was the simple, direct communication of someone who did not want her in the path of what was coming and did not know how to say so, without it sounding like the same ownership she had rejected. You don't have to, he started. I know where the corridor goes, she said. Don't, a beat. He didn't argue. They went up the stairs together, and the house above them was quiet in the specific way that houses went quiet when something wrong had already happened, and the people inside hadn't caught up to it yet. And Mara moved through it with her pulse in her ears, and her hands steady, and her mind running the layout she had memorized from the moment she walked in, because she had always memorized layouts, because knowing where the exits were was something she had learned to do before she learned almost anything else. And right now there was a child somewhere in this house, or on this property, who had looked back at her through an elevator door with careful, assessing eyes, and she was not going to let the wrong people have him. She reached the kitchen corridor first. The service door at the end was ajar. Cold air moved through it from outside. Mara pushed through it and stepped into the east courtyard where the basketball hoop stood over its worn patch of asphalt. And at the far end of the courtyard, near the wall, she could see 3 things simultaneously. A black vehicle with its engine running, a man she didn't recognize holding a phone to his ear, and Elliot Virelli standing 6 feet away from the vehicle's open door, with his arms crossed over his chest and his jaw set and his eyes doing the particular thing they did when he was frightened and refusing to show it, which she recognized, because she had seen that exact expression in the mirror for most of her adult life. He had not gotten in the vehicle. He had not gotten in the vehicle. Whatever they had told him, whatever they had promised or threatened, he had planted his feet on the asphalt beneath the basketball hoop his father had installed for him, and he had not moved. Mara came through the service door. Elliot saw her. Something broke open in his face, not relief exactly. Something more complicated than relief. Particular expression of a child who has been holding a position alone and has just seen backup arrive and can finally allow the fear to be what it actually was. The man with the phone turned. Dante came through the door behind her, and in the courtyard of a house that had once been a family home and had been converted over years into something else. The last moment before everything collapsed into its final shape held itself suspended for exactly a second, everyone in it, understanding simultaneously that the configuration of who was where and what they each knew had just become irreversible. The man with the phone said something into it. Inside the vehicle, a second man reached for the door handle. Dante moved. And Mara was already moving before he did, because she had spent 9 years becoming someone who was never again going to stand still while someone suffered. And Elliot Varelli was 8 years old and frightened, and had not gotten into the vehicle. And that one fact, that small, stubborn, remarkable fact, was the thing she was going to make sure was not wasted. The man with the phone did not expect Mara to come at him from the left. He expected Dante. Every muscle in his body was oriented toward Dante, the threat he had been briefed on, the name he'd been paid to manage, the man whose reputation preceded him into every room he entered. He had a hand moving toward his jacket, and his eyes locked Dante's approach, and he had completely failed to account for the woman in the nurse's bag, who had spent 9 years learning how not to be the person anyone accounted for. Mara hit him with her shoulder at full momentum, driving into his right arm, before the hand cleared the jacket, and the impact was awkward and graceless, and exactly effective enough. He stumbled sideways into the wall. The phone skittered across the asphalt. She stepped back and put herself between him and Elliot without thinking about it. Pure instinct, the body making a decision the mind hadn't finished yet. Dante reached the vehicle door in 3 strides. The second man had it half open when Dante got there, and what followed was not elegant. It was 2 large men in a confined space, both of them certain about what they were doing, and the sound of it was ugly and immediate, and Elliot flinched at it even though he didn't look away. The man from the vehicle went down onto the asphalt. Dante stepped back, breathing hard, his hand pressed against his side where the wound that had put him in a coma 11 days ago was now making its objections known in sharp, insistent terms. First man Mara's man had recovered. He was upright, calculating, looking between her and Dante with the particular reassessment of someone revising his threat matrix in real time. Then Tavio came through the service door behind them with 2 of Dante's people, and the reassessment became academic. Courtyard went still. Elliot uncrossed his arms. He looked at his father, at the way Dante was holding his side, at the deliberate steadiness of a man refusing to let the pain show in front of his son. And something moved across the boy's face that was too old for 8 and entirely earned. He walked across the asphalt and put himself against Dante's side, not the injured side, the other one, precisely chosen, and Dante's arm came around him and held on. Mara stood in the cold air of the courtyard and watched them and did not look away, because this was real, and she had been present for the realest parts of it, and looking away would have been its own kind of dishonesty. The next 4 hours were the kind of hours that happened inside a crisis and could not be reconstructed cleanly. Afterward, they existed as fragments, images, particular fatigue of moving through one necessary action after another, with no pause between them to absorb what any of it meant. Garrett arrived at the estate at 11:40, which meant he had been closer than she'd realized when she'd sent the photographs. Came with two other people, former colleagues, he said, who had continued building the case independently after he resigned, and they moved through the lower level of the house with the focused efficiency of people who had been waiting for exactly this access for a very long time. Mara sat at the kitchen table and watched Dora make coffee that nobody asked for, and everyone eventually drank. Dante had been taken to a room where someone who was not Mara could look at his side. The insistence of everyone around him, and the eventual compliance of a man who had decided that winning the argument was less important than being vertical for the rest of the day. He came back to the kitchen 20 minutes later, moving carefully, and sat across from Mara without speaking for a moment. "Elliot?" she asked. "With Tavio. He's fine." He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug Dora had set in front of him. "Me if you were okay." She looked at the table. "Told him you were fine," Dante said. "He said he knew. He said you looked like someone who was always going to be fine." She looked up at that. Dante was watching her with the same expression she had first categorized as unreadable, and had since learned to read more accurately. It was the expression of a man who was fully present in the moment. He was in, and was not performing anything about it. Valmont's team were operating on his direct instruction. Dante said. Garrett confirmed it. Aldrich Valmont wanted Elliot because he knew what I was going to do to the port contracts once I understood what Raphael had built, and a man who is losing a financial empire does irrational things. He paused. He did not consult Serena. Mara waited. She didn't know about Elliot, Dante said. She knew about the compliance file. She knew about the manipulation. She signed off on everything done to you in this hospital. But she didn't know her father was going to put a hand on my son. He said the last 4 words with a specific quietness that was more frightening than volume would have been. That distinction doesn't make her less responsible for what she did, but it's accurate, and I've been trying to stay accurate today. Where is she now? Mara asked. At her father's office. She doesn't know yet what happened here this morning. He looked at his coffee. She's going to find out very soon. Mara thought about Serena in the consultation alcove with her coat over her arm and her carefully arranged concern. She thought about the flowers on the nursing station counter, white and expensive. She thought about the first morning the practiced assessment, the voice that was pleasant in the specific way of someone who had never needed anything other than pleasantness to get what they wanted. She tried to find anger and found something more tired than that. Not forgiveness, she wasn't there, and she wasn't sure she was going to get there, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a prepared response to a threat for so long that when the threat finally collapses, the prepared response has nowhere to go. Compliance file, she said. It'll be gone by end of day, Dante said. Garrett has enough on the hospital administrator, who provided the system access that the conversation is going to be brief and productive. She nodded. Mara. He said her name with a deliberateness that meant what came next was something he had been deciding how to say. I'm going to turn over everything to the federal prosecutors. Garrett's contacts, the new ones, the ones who aren't compromised, I've already spoken to them this morning. The internal contact Raphael was using inside the task force, the Valmont arrangements, the shell companies, the entire structure. He looked at her directly. Including the records from your father's company, including the documentation of how the bankruptcy was arranged. She was very still. That won't undo it, she said. No, it won't. He didn't look away. But the people responsible will be named in a federal proceeding. Financial recovery on assets that were fraudulently acquired, that's a civil matter that Garrett tells me has strong grounds. He paused. It's not what your family deserved. Nothing I can do is what your family deserved. But it's what I can actually do, and I'm going to do it. Kitchen was warm. Outside, through the window, the east courtyard was visible, the basketball hoop, the worn asphalt, the wall where Aldrich Valmont's men had been standing, an hour ago. The vehicle was gone. Courtyard looked exactly like what it was, which was the place where an 8-year-old boy played basketball and sometimes sat on worn asphalt and decided, apparently, not to get into a car that strangers had driven to his home. He didn't get in, Mara said. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. No, Dante said. His voice was different on that word, layered with something she understood was not going to be fully expressed, and didn't need to be. He knew they were wrong, she said. He knew. Dante turned the coffee mug in his hands. He said they told him there was an emergency and his father needed him to go with them. And he said he thought about it for about 10 seconds and then decided that if his father actually needed him, his father would have called. He looked at her. He said he learned that from watching you, watching how you checked things yourself instead of taking other people's word. Mara put her hand flat on the table. She pressed it there and breathed. Serena came to the estate at 2 in the afternoon. Mara knew she was coming because Dante had told her she was coming, and she had chosen to stay, which was its own decision made quietly in the kitchen over a second cup of coffee, while Garrett's team worked in the lower level and Dora moved around them all with the imperturbable efficiency of a woman who had seen worse in this house and expected to see more. Serena came through the front door and stopped when she saw Mara in the corridor, and something moved across her face that was not what Mara had expected. She had expected anger. She had expected the particular fury of a woman who had orchestrated an elaborate humiliation campaign and found it had not worked. What she saw instead was something more fractured than that, a woman who had spent the morning learning about her father's decisions and was still visibly inside the shock of it, particular devastation of discovering that the person who taught you how power worked had been using it on people you hadn't authorized. She looked older than she had 2 weeks ago. She looked, Mara thought, like a woman who had won every argument she'd ever had with the world, and had just found out that the world had been letting her win. I didn't know about Elliot, Serena said. She said it to Mara, not to Dante, which surprised them both. I know, Mara said, that doesn't. Serena stopped, pressed her lips together. I know it doesn't fix what I did. File, the assignment. I knew what I was doing. I knew why I chose you. Her voice was controlled, but only just, the kind of control that was one wrong word away from losing itself. Chose you because you had nothing. Because I looked at your file and I saw someone with no connections, no family in this city, no financial resources, no one who would make noise if things got difficult for you. She said it with the blunt specificity of someone who was past the point of self-protecting through euphemism. I thought that made you easy to move. I thought that was all you were. Corridor was quiet. You were wrong, Mara said. She said it without heat. It was just the fact of it. Yes, Serena said. I was wrong. She looked at Dante then, and the look between them was long and had the weight of 2 years, of a particular kind of arrangement, not a love story. Mara understood, but a practical alliance that had perhaps contained some genuine feeling somewhere underneath the practicality. And whatever it had contained, it was over. My father's lawyers are already in contact with the prosecutors, Serena said to Dante. He's going to try to minimize. He's going to try to redirect toward Raphael. She paused. I'm not going to help him do that. Dante looked at her for a moment. Serena, don't, she said. Not sharply, tiredly. I know what's coming. I've known since this morning. She pulled her coat around herself, which was the same coat she had been wearing. The first morning Mara had seen her, and Mara had the disorienting sense of the whole thing having moved in a vast circle and returned to its starting shape, changed in every particular. I'll cooperate with the investigation. I'll give them what I have on my father's arrangements. She looked at Mara one last time. I'm sorry, she said. Not because it's useful, just because it's true. She left. The front door closed behind her. Dante stood in the corridor looking at where she had been, and Mara stood beside him and said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say about the specific wreckage that a relationship became when the foundations it was built on, when the foundation structure had been constructed by people who didn't ask permission. Raphael was taken into federal custody at 4:15 that afternoon. He went without resistance, which was not surprising. He was 61 years old and had spent 15 years managing a structure complex enough that he understood when a structure had passed the point of being salvageable. He walked out of the lower level of the house with Garrett and 2 federal officers, and he did not look at Dante as he passed him in the corridor. Dante watched him go. Mara was at the end of the corridor, giving them the distance that the moment required, but she could see Dante's face in profile, the particular stillness of it, the absence of satisfaction that might have been expected, presence instead of something heavier and less clean. She had thought the hardest thing would be the confrontation. She had been wrong. The confrontation was loud and physical and full of adrenaline, and the adrenaline carried you through it. The hardest thing was standing in the corridor. After it, watching the man who had been the closest thing to a father figure in a family that had been organized around his nephew's empire, walking out in the custody of federal officers, and having no feeling about it that was simple enough to name. Dante stood there for a long time after Raphael was gone. Then he turned and found her at the end of the corridor and walked toward her, and he stopped about 3 feet away, which was a careful distance, a chosen distance. "It's done," he said. "Most of it," she said. "The legal process is going to take a long time." "I know." He looked at her. "Are you going to be here for it?" She held his gaze and thought about the question the way it deserved to be thought about, not as a romantic question, not as a strategic one, but as the specific question it actually was, which was whether she had a place in what came after this, and whether she wanted one, and whether wanting one and having one were things she was prepared to let coexist. "I'm going back to the hospital," she said, "to my work." "That's what I am." He nodded. He had expected that. "But I'm not disappearing," she said. "The civil case for my father's estate, I'm going to be part of that. I'm going to see it through." She paused. "And Elliot knows how to reach me. I told him that." Something moved in Dante's face that was not quite a smile, but was in the same territory. "He's going to use that," Dante said. "I know," she said. "That's why I told him." The weeks that followed moved with the particular rhythm of institutional processes, federal indictments, asset seizures, the grinding machinery of legal proceedings that had no respect for narrative momentum and cared nothing for the people whose lives had generated the evidence they were processing. Mara returned to her nursing work. She was reassigned to a different floor, a public ward. Ordinary in all the ways the Varelli private ICU had not been, and she found that she was glad for the ordinariness, that it settled something in her that had been unsettled for longer than 2 weeks. Garrett's case moved faster than she had expected. The federal contact Raphael had been paying was suspended within a month, a name in a proceeding. Career ending in the specific bureaucratic way that careers ended when the paper trail was complete and there was no longer any ambiguity about what it said. Aldrich Valmont's assets were frozen. Serena, who had given a full cooperation statement to the prosecutors, disappeared from the city with the particular thoroughness of someone who understood that staying was not a viable option. The civil recovery process for her father's company was slower. Mara sat with a lawyer twice a week for 3 months and went through documents and gave testimony and explained things she had not spoken about in 9 years. And each time she sat in that office, she felt the specific cost of it, not the grief she had expected, not the catharsis that people described, but a flat, steady expenditure of something she's been storing for a long time, like draining something that had been pressing against her for years. Not relief, not yet. Something that might become relief, eventually, if she let it. Dante called her on the 4th Thursday of the first month. He said Elliot had a school presentation about hospitals and wanted to know if she would answer some questions. She said yes. The questions took 40 minutes because Elliot's questions always went longer than they appeared to be at the start. And at the end, Elliot said, "Thank you," in a way that was full and slightly awkward and completely genuine. And she heard Dante in the background say something to him in a low voice that she couldn't make out. She and Dante talked for another 20 minutes after Elliot went to bed. It was not romantic. It was two people who had been through something significant together and were testing whether they could be in contact without that significance becoming the whole of what they were to each other. It was careful and honest, and sometimes uncomfortable, which she took as a good sign. Comfortable conversations between people who had no real relationship were easy to maintain and led nowhere. He called the following Thursday, and the one after that. The trauma wing dedication happened on a Tuesday in late autumn, 7 months after the morning in the courtyard. Mara found out about it, the way she found out about most things at the hospital, through the internal newsletter 2 weeks before the event, which listed the new wing's purpose and its funding source and the dedication date. Funding was listed as anonymous. She read the newsletter in the break room and set it down and went back to work. On the day of the dedication, she was on shift. She went because it was during her break and the new wing was in her building, and she was curious about the space in the professional way. She was curious about all medical spaces, the layout, the equipment, particular logic of how a trauma environment was organized. The small lobby of the new wing had a dedication plaque on the wall beside the entrance. She stood in front of it. The plaque had 2 names on it. Hers was the second one. She stood there for a moment, with people moving around her and the ordinary hospital noise of the building continuing on all sides, and she looked at her name on the wall and felt something that she could not immediately name, and then it was. Feeling of having a fact acknowledged by something outside herself, something permanent, something that did not require her to carry it alone. Her father had spent his life building something. People with more power had taken it. The law had been used to protect the taking, and she had spent 9 years being careful and competent and invisible, and none of that had given her back what was taken, and she had made a kind of peace with that. But her name was on the wall, and the wing would treat people who came in broken and frightened and in need of someone who would not look away. She stood there for a little while longer than she planned. Then she heard footsteps behind her and turned and found Dante standing in the entrance of the new wing with Elliot beside him, both of them in coats, both of them looking at her with the same careful eyes that she had come to understand were not a family trait so much as a shared adaptation. The particular watchfulness of people who had learned that what happened next depended heavily on what they noticed now. "You weren't supposed to see it until today," Dante said. "Dora told me you'd figure it out early." I didn't believe her. "I didn't figure it out early," Mara said. "I read the newsletter. The newsletter listed you as a funding partner. It listed an anonymous donor. The second name on that plaque is yours," Dante said. "I thought you'd—" "I read it this morning," she said. "I'm here during my break." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the plaque. Then he looked back at her. And this time the expression on his face was the one she had no more difficulty reading, the one that had been building for 7 months across Thursday phone calls, and a civil proceeding, and the particular slow work of 2 people, deciding what they were to each other outside of a crisis. "I should have asked you first," he said. "Yes," she said. "You should have." "I'm asking now," he said. "Late. I know it's late. But is this okay?" She looked at the plaque. Her name's beside his, on a wall in a hospital that would treat people who needed it, regardless of who they were or who they knew. "It's okay," she said. Elliot had been quiet during all of this, which she knew by now was a sign not of disengagement, but of the opposite. He went quiet when he was paying close attention, when something mattered enough to warrant his full concentration. He was looking at the plaque, too. Your name is first, he said to Dante. He said it as a neutral observation, the tone of someone gathering data. It was alphabetical, Dante said. Elliot looked at Mara. True? I have no idea, she said. I just found out about this. Elliot considered the plaque for another moment. It should be alphabetical by first name, he said. Then yours is first. He looked at Mara. Mara comes before Dante. She looked at him. He looked back at her with those careful eyes, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was very small and entirely intentional. She felt something in her chest that she had been guarding against for 7 months, because she had not been certain it was safe, and in the lobby of the new trauma wing on a Tuesday in late autumn, she decided that certainty was something you waited for, when you could afford to wait for it, and that she had spent long enough waiting. Hospital gift shop has terrible coffee, she said. I know where the good coffee is. 20 minutes I'm still on break. Elliot looked at Dante. Dante looked at Mara. All three of us? Dante said. All three of you, she said. She walked toward the elevator. Behind her, she heard Elliot's footsteps on the polished floor, quick, certain, unguarded. She heard Dante follow a moment later, more deliberate, with the particular gait of a man who was still measuring the cost of where he put his weight. She pressed the elevator button and waited. When the doors opened, she stepped in and held them. Elliot came in first, then Dante, who stood beside her and did not take her hand, because they were not there yet, and he knew it and she knew it. And the knowing was itself a kind of intimacy, the kind that didn't require demonstration. The elevator doors closed. She looked at the numbers above the door, counting down floors. Behind her eyes, 9 years of careful, solitary construction, the new name, the nursing degree, the apartment with the notes she had kept, because destroying them felt like giving something away. The long work of becoming a person who could not be easily dismantled, settled into something she had not expected them to become. Not armor anymore, just history. Just the specific weight of how she had gotten here, carried not as a burden, but as a record. This happened, and I survived it, and I am still the person who survived it. And that person is standing in an elevator with an 8-year-old who is going to ask her 3 follow-up questions about hospital coffee before they reach the ground floor. Elliot asked 2. The third one he saved until they were outside, walking through the autumn air toward the small cafe on the corner that she had found in her second week at this hospital, and had kept as a small private thing, a place that was hers. She told him about it, and he listened with the full attention he gave to things that mattered, and she understood that she was giving him something she had not given anyone in a very long time, a piece of the ordinary private geography of her daily life, and that giving it felt not like loss, but like expansion. Dante walked beside her and said nothing, which was the right thing, which she had come to understand was something he was capable of, the specific discipline of knowing when words were the wrong tool and presence was the right one. They walked through the autumn air together, all 3 of them, toward coffee and a Tuesday, and the ordinary, unremarkable continuation of days that had no emergency in them, no crisis, no one in a corridor saying she stays, as if her presence were something to be commanded. She was there because she chose to be. That was the whole of it, and it was enough, and it was hers. The civil proceeding concluded on a Wednesday in February, 8 months after the morning in the courtyard. Mara sat in a federal courthouse on the 14th floor and listened to a judge, read a summary judgment that was 63 pages long, and that she had read in full 3 times before today, because she did not trust important things to surprise her. The judgment found in favor of the estate of her father, confirmed fraudulent acquisition of assets through Raphael Varelli's shell company network, and ordered the return of liquidated proceeds with interest accrued over the 9 years since the bankruptcy. The number was not what her family had lost. It never would be. You could not put a number on what her father's face had looked like outside that lawyer's office. or what her mother's voice had sounded like in the last year of her life when she stopped asking questions about the future because she had run out of future she could imagine. Could not file those things in a federal proceeding or assign them a dollar value or return them through a summary judgment. But the number was real, and the judgment was real, and the names in the finding were real Raphael Varelli, Eldrick Valmont, and 4 other individuals who had participated in the network at varying levels of culpability, all named, all on the permanent public record of a federal court. Her father had asked questions. They had destroyed him for asking. And now the asking was in the record, and the destroying was in the record, and the destroying, and the record was not going anywhere. Mara sat in the courthouse and listened to the judgment and kept her hands flat on her thighs and her face composed. And when it was over, she walked out into the February air and stood on the courthouse steps alone for a few minutes and let the cold move through her coat. Her lawyer came out behind her and shook her hand and said things that were warm and professional and true, and she thanked him and meant it. And then he left, and she was alone on the steps again. She took out her phone. She looked at it. She called Garrett. He picked up on the second ring. She could hear street noise behind him. He was outside, somewhere, moving, which was how he seemed to exist most of the time now. He had taken a position with a nonprofit legal organization that worked on financial fraud cases, which suited him in the way that some people found the work that suited them only after the institution they'd built their career inside had failed them. Judgment came down, she said. A pause. Then, in full, she heard him exhale. Not dramatically, just the specific release of someone setting down something they had been carrying for a long time. Good, he said. That was all. It was sufficient. She hung up and stood on the steps for another minute. Then she went back to work, because she had a shift at 2, and the courthouse was 12 minutes from the hospital, and she had learned a long time ago that the best thing to do after a significant event was to put your hands into the next necessary thing. She told Dante that evening. He had developed the habit, over the past months, of texting before calling, not asking permission, exactly, but giving her the option to choose the moment rather than receive the call mid-thought. She had not asked him to do this. He had simply observed, at some point, that she was a person who did better with a moment of preparation and had adjusted accordingly. She had noticed the adjustment without remarking on it, because remarking on it would have made it into something larger than it needed to be, and they had both gotten good at not making things larger than they needed to be. She called him back at 7, after her shift, sitting in her car in the hospital parking lot with the engine running for warmth, told him about the judgment. He listened without interrupting, which was a quality she had come to rely on, the specific patience of someone who understood that information delivered in sequence meant more than information extracted by questions. When she finished, he said, "How do you feel?" She looked at the parking lot, the ordinary evening geography of a hospital parking structure, other cars, fluorescent light, the distant sound of an ambulance. "Something closed," she said. "Not healed, just closed. Like a door that was open for 9 years finally shut. Good?" She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "I think it is." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Elliot wants to know if you're coming Saturday. He won't ask me to ask you, because he thinks that's indirect. But he's mentioned 3 times that the cafe on the corner has a new pastry." She felt the corner of her mouth move. "He's mentioned it to me too. He sent a photograph." "Of course he did." "Tell him yes," she said. "I'll be there at 10. She heard Dante relay this information and heard Elliot's response, which was brief and controlled in the way he controlled things. When something pleased him more than he wanted to show. 10, Dante confirmed. 10, she said. She drove home through the February city and cooked dinner and ate it at her kitchen table, and the kitchen was the same kitchen where she had sat at 2 in the morning 9 months ago with her laptop and her old notes, pulling at a thread she hadn't known would lead here. The table was the same table. The notes were still in the drawer. She had not destroyed them because she was done making decisions about her own history out of fear. But she had not looked at them in 8 months because she no longer needed to. She ate her dinner and washed her plate and went to bed at a reasonable hour. She slept without difficulty, which was something that had once required effort, and now simply happened, and she noticed it the way you notice small recoveries quietly, without ceremony, with the private knowledge that the distance between who you had been and who you were now was real even when it was invisible to everyone else. On Saturday, she arrived at the cafe at 9:53 and found Elliot already there, alone at the corner table, with the new pastry in front of him and his tablet beside it. He looked up when she came in with the assessing eyes that had not changed since the day she found him on the floor of the administrative room, still careful, still taking inventory, still arriving at conclusions before he announced them. "You're early," he said. "So are you," she said, sitting across from him. "I wanted to make sure we got this table." He looked at the pastry. "I got one for you, too." The woman behind the counter said they sell out. Mara looked at the second pastry, which had been sitting there waiting for her, and felt the small, uncomplicated warmth of it. "Thank you," she said. He nodded with the dignity of someone who had planned well and was satisfied with the execution. Then he picked up his tablet and said, without looking at her, "My dad said the court thing was finished." It was. "Are you glad?" She looked at him. He was still looking at the tablet, which she had learned was how he asked the questions that actually mattered sideways, giving her the option to answer without the pressure of direct eye contact, which he had somehow intuited she sometimes needed. "Yes," she said. "Very glad." He nodded again. Then he set the tablet down and looked at her directly, which meant this was the important part. "He's different," Elliot said. "My dad. Since all of it." He said it carefully, assembling the sentence as he went. "Doesn't just decide things. He asks about what I want, what I think. He didn't used to do that as much." He paused. "I think he thought deciding things was the same as taking care of people." Mara looked at this 8-year-old who had figured out in 9 months what took most people considerably longer. "A lot of people think that," she said. "Do you?" "I used to think the opposite," she said. "I thought taking care of yourself meant never needing anyone to decide anything with you." She picked up the pastry. "I'm working on finding something in the middle." Elliot considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "That seems harder than either of the other two." "It is," she said. "The other two don't actually work." He thought about that for a moment. Then he picked up his own pastry and took a bite and looked out the window at the Saturday morning street, and the conversation moved on to the presentation he had coming up and a book he was reading, and whether the cafe's hot chocolate was better than the hospital gift shops, which it was, definitively, by every measure. Dante arrived at 10:12, slightly late, which he apologized for, without excessive apology, and sat beside Elliot and across from Mara and ordered coffee. He looked at the two of them across the small table, his son, the woman who had come into his house to do a job, and had instead become the specific person who had made it impossible for him to keep being the version of himself that didn't examine his own decisions and said nothing for a moment. Elliot was explaining the pastry's merits. Dante listened. Mara watched Dante listen, and what she saw in his face was the thing that had been growing in it for months, not the ICU look, not the managed composure, not the particular controlled expression of a man who had spent his career making sure no one could read his next move. Something more open than that. Something that had been there all along, she suspected, underneath the edifice of who he had needed to be, and that was only now, in the ordinary light of a Saturday cafe, with his son explaining pastry, being allowed the surface. Caught her watching. She didn't look away. He didn't either. "The wing has its first trauma intake numbers," she said. From this month, I looked at the preliminary data. And, he said, it's working, she said. The response times are down. The outcomes in the first 30 cases are better than the department average. She paused. It's working. He nodded. He looked at the table for a moment, with the same gesture she had first seen in the hospital, hand flat, grounding himself, and then looked back at her. There's something I want to say, he said. I've been deciding how to say it for a while. Elliot looked at his tablet with the focused disinterest of someone who was absolutely listening. I know what I was, Dante said. He said it plainly, without the performance of confession, which would have made it about her response, rather than about the truth of it. I know what the organization was. I know that the legitimate front I told myself I was building still held up structures that Raphael used to do things I didn't examine closely enough because examining them was inconvenient. He looked at her steadily. I'm not going to tell you I've become someone else entirely. I'm the same man with different information and different choices in front of me. The choices I've been making since February of last year are the choices I intend to keep making. And I wanted you to know that's not because of you. He paused. It's adjacent to you. You were the person who made it impossible for me to pretend the information wasn't there. The choices are mine, and I want them to be mine. I don't want you to feel responsible for them. The cafe moved around them, other tables, other conversations, the ordinary Saturday noise of a city going about its February morning. Mara sat with what he had said and gave it the weight it deserved, which was considerable. Because he had named the thing, she had been most careful about the question of whether what he was becoming was real and his own, or whether it was a reflection of her, built to hold her attention, the kind of thing that collapsed when the attention moved elsewhere. He had named it and answered it in the same breath. I know, she said. He looked at her. I've been watching, she said, for months. That's what I do. She held his gaze. I know. Elliot put his tablet down and picked up his hot chocolate and looked out the window with the serenity of someone who has just witnessed a conclusion he had projected several weeks in advance and is refraining from commenting on it. Mara looked at him and caught the very deliberate quality of his window gazing. You're not subtle, she said. I'm very subtle, he said, without turning from the window. You put the pastry on the table before I arrived. That was practical. You texted me the photograph 3 days ago. He turned from the window. His face was composed and his eyes were doing the thing they did when something pleased him. The pastry is genuinely good, he said. That was an objective recommendation. Dante was watching his son with an expression that was unguarded in a way that made Mara think of the basketball hoop in the east courtyard, of the worn asphalt, specific evidence scattered across a property of what a man actually was when no one was measuring his power. Finish your hot chocolate, Dante said. I'm finished, Elliot said. He was not finished. Drink it. Elliot drank it with the exaggerated patience of someone complying under protest. Mara finished her pastry. Outside the window, the February city continued its Saturday people on the pavement, a dog pulling at a leash, a couple arguing pleasantly about which direction to walk. The ordinary, irreducible texture of a city full of people who were not in a federal proceeding or a private ICU or a basement room with reinforced walls, who were simply moving through their morning. She thought about her father, who had asked questions and paid for asking them. She thought about her mother, who had spent her last years without future. She thought about the 19-year-old version of herself, standing outside a lawyer's office and deciding in the specific wordless way of decisions that change direction of travel, that disappearing was not the same as surviving. She had not disappeared. She was here, in a cafe, on a Saturday, with a man she had chosen, and a boy she had not expected, and a name on a wall, in a hospital that treated people who came in broken and frightened. She had not disappeared. She reached across the small table and set her hand on top of Dante's, which was flat on the table in the way it always was when he was thinking, and she left it there, not as a declaration, not as a performance of anything, but as the simple physical fact of a choice made clearly, in daylight, without emergency or necessity, or anyone in a corridor telling her where to be. Dante turned his hand over beneath hers. Outside, the February city moved through its morning. Dog. A couple finding their direction. An ordinary street doing the ordinary, unremarkable work of being a place where people lived. Elliot finished his hot chocolate and set the cup down with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has exactly the morning he arranged for. And he looked out the window and said nothing. Because there was nothing that needed saying. Because some things were already complete.